The two gardens, the gift of the land. Spring opened her arms wide over Elderbrook, and with her came the scent of new beginnings. Every morning, Anya and Ben could be seen at their plots, working under the same soft light, though their efforts could not have looked more different. Anya began her garden with a burst of energy. She hired two of the village boys to clear the rocks, though she quickly grew impatient with their pace and began tossing them aside herself. She filled her cart with bright flowers from distant towns, blooms bred for beauty rather than strength. "The soil will learn to keep up," she said with a laugh, planting each flower close and tight, their roots competing for space. She watered them heavily, certain that more must be better. Ben, on the other hand, spent his first week simply watching. He noticed where the dew lingered longest in the morning, where the sun struck hardest by midday, and how the rain pooled in the dips of his land. He broke the soil slowly, one patch at a time, saving every earthworm he uncovered and returning it gently to the ground. When the villagers passed by, they often wondered if he was doing anything at all. One evening, old Mrs. Corn, who had grown vegetables longer than anyone could remember, stopped by Ben's plot. "You've still got nothing planted," she said, leaning on her cane. "Not yet," Ben replied with a smile. "The soil isn't ready to give. I'm still listening to it." She chuckled softly. "Listening to dirt, are you?" "Everything that grows," he said, "has something to say first." By midsummer, Anya's garden had become a spectacle. Petals of every color fluttered in the wind like painted silk. Villagers came to admire it, marveling at how quickly she had transformed barren land into something radiant. Anya basked in their praise, standing proudly among her flowers. But as the days grew hotter, her garden began to change. The blossoms drooped, the soil cracked from thirst. Despite all her watering, the roots had grown shallow, unused to searching deep. The exotic flowers, unaccustomed to Elderbrook's winds, tore easily. The colors began to fade. Ben's garden, in contrast, remained humble, a few rows of herbs, wildflowers, and small vegetables at first. But the plants stood strong, their leaves rich and green. His soil had darkened, full of worms and life. Bees buzzed happily from bloom to bloom, and sparrows often gathered there to rest. When he harvested his first basket of vegetables, he shared them quietly with his neighbors, insisting, "There's more than enough." By autumn, the difference was clear. Anya's once dazzling garden had withered into dry stalks, while Ben's was alive with late blooms and ripening fruit. When the villagers gathered again at harvest time, their eyes lingered on the two plots, one a memory of beauty, the other a living gift. The mayor approached them both and said, "You were given the same soil, the same sun, the same rain. Yet one garden was made for show, and the other for growth." Anya, humble, looked down at her empty ground. "I planted what I wanted to see," she admitted softly. Ben smiled, wiping earth from his hands. "And I planted what the land wanted to be." That winter, snow fell gently over Elderbrook, covering both gardens in a shared blanket of white. And when spring came again, two neighbors stood side by side once more, one ready to begin anew, the other ready to help her listen. Seeds of desire. The days grew warmer, and Anya's garden became the talk of Elderbrook. Children stopped by her gate to gape at the blossoms, and even the mayor's wife came one afternoon to ask where she had found such fine orchids. "Oh, a little trip to Ravenford," Anya said with a practiced smile. "One must know where to look, and of course, how to plant them properly." She said it loudly enough for Ben to hear. He was across the lane, knee-deep in his soil, turning it again and again. His back ached, his hands were cracked, but he didn't seem to notice. He worked slowly, rhythmically, as though listening to something beneath the earth. Anya's garden, meanwhile, began to change. At first, it was only small things, a few drooping petals, a faint yellowing on the leaves. "Too much sun," she muttered, and fetched her watering can. But the next morning, more blooms had faded, and the air smelled faintly sour. By the third week, her dahlias had wilted entirely. "No, no, no," she whispered, kneeling beside them. She poured more water, sprinkled fertilizer, even whispered encouragements to the dying plants. Yet nothing helped. The soil beneath was dry and crusted, and when she tried to dig deeper, her spade struck the same hard stone she had ignored before. Across the lane, Ben's plot still looked empty, just dark, freshly turned soil. But when the wind shifted, it carried the rich scent of life, earth and rain, and something quietly growing. Small shoots, green and shy, began to push through the ground. Anya saw them one morning and scoffed. "Weeds already?" she called. Ben only smiled. "Not weeds, patience." He didn't explain further, and that irked her more than she liked to admit. She had been so certain that beauty could be bought, that admiration could be planted in a day. Yet her garden now looked tired and sickly, while Ben's was, though plain, peaceful, even promising. By midsummer, Elderbrook had changed its tune. Fewer visitors came to Anya's gate. Those who did only offered polite smiles before glancing wistfully at Ben's yard, where tall stems now swayed sunflowers, marigolds, wild roses, all blooming from the earth he had so carefully tended. Anya watched one evening as fireflies drifted above his garden like golden sparks. He was sitting in the grass, wiping dirt from his hands, the fading light painting his face in soft amber. For the first time she felt not envy, but something deeper, a quiet longing she could not name. She looked back at her own garden, at the withered petals and brittle stems, and a question formed in her heart. Had she ever really loved the flowers, or only what they said about her? That night she couldn't sleep. The air through her open window smelled faintly of Ben's compost and rain-soaked soil, and it stirred something restless inside her, the first stirring of humility, perhaps, or the first seed of a new kind of desire. When the sun beat down, by midsummer, the hills around Elderbrook shimmered with heat. The once green fields faded to gold, and the streams ran thin. Dust rose from every step, clinging to skin and breath alike. Even the birds grew silent, retreating to the shade of the elder trees. Anya's garden, once the pride of the village, began to suffer. The flowers that had looked radiant only weeks before now drooped. Their leaves curled at the edges, and their stems bent under the unforgiving sun. Each day she woke to more brown edges, more fallen petals, more silent accusations of her failure. She rushed outside with her watering can, dousing the plants each morning and evening. But the water pooled at the surface and ran off. The roots were shallow and weak, never having learned to seek water below. The ground beneath her feet grew hard as pottery, cracked like old skin. Just one more week, she told herself. The rain will come. It has to. But the rain did not come. One windy night, a storm rolled through. Not the gentle kind that brings relief, but a violent one that lashes without mercy. The wind howled between the hills, bending trees and scattering branches. Thunder boomed over Elderbrook, and lightning flashed like a blade through the dark. When morning came, Anya stepped outside and gasped. Half her flowers were lying flat, their roots exposed to the sun. Petals were strewn across the ground like torn silk. The air smelled of wet earth and ruin. She sank to her knees in despair. "No, no, I spent so much on you." Her hands, trembling and soil-stained, brushed over broken stems as if touch alone could bring them back to life. But the garden was still. Only the wind moved now, whispering through what remained. Across the fence, Ben's garden looked different. Green shoots had begun to rise, sturdy and slow. His soil, soft and dark, held moisture even through the heat. When the storm came, his young plants bent but did not break. Their deep roots anchored them. The next day, Anya stormed over to Ben's fence. "How?" she demanded. "How is your garden alive when mine is dying?" "We have the same sun and rain." Ben leaned on his spade and looked thoughtfully at her wilted blooms. "We do," he said softly, "but we don't have the same soil." Anya frowned. "Soil is soil." He smiled. "Soil is life. You planted beauty, Anya. I planted patience." She huffed and turned away, unwilling to hear the lesson. But as she looked at her brittle flowers, a small knot of doubt formed in her chest. That night she couldn't sleep. His words circled her mind like moths around a lantern. Soil is life. I planted patience. The next morning she knelt beside her garden, not to water but to touch the earth itself. It was pale and dry, lifeless beneath the surface. She dug a little deeper. The soil turned to dust between her fingers. She thought of how quickly she had bought her seeds, how eager she had been to see color, how she had never thought about what lay beneath. For the first time, Anya understood. Her flowers had lived shallow lives because she had given them shallow ground. She spent the next days in silence, clearing the broken stems, turning the earth. She mixed in compost, ash, and fallen leaves from the nearby wood. The scent of decay filled the air, but beneath it, she smelled something else, something living. Ben watched from across the fence but said nothing. He only nodded when she caught his eye. Weeks passed. The heat broke, and a thin rain began to fall again. Tiny green shoots poked through the dark, rich soil, humble and slow. Anya didn't rush them this time. She waited, watering only when the ground asked for it, watching as the roots grew strong before the flowers dared to show their faces. One morning she found a single bloom, a small, pale blossom no bigger than her thumb. It wasn't as showy as her old garden, but it stood straight against the wind, its petals trembling but unbroken. She smiled then, for the first time in months. And from across the fence, Ben smiled too. The quiet work of growth. Autumn came to Elderbrook with cool mornings and a hint of mist clinging to the hills. The air smelled faintly of apples and damp leaves, and the world seemed to be holding its breath before winter. Children ran laughing through the lanes, gathering armfuls of golden and crimson leaves, tossing them skyward until they fell again like slow rain. Anya watched them from her porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her garden lay before her, or what was left of it. The once bright flowers she had planted in the spring were now wilted, their stems brittle and gray. The soil had hardened into pale clumps, and weeds stood where roses had been. Even the air around her little plot seemed duller, stripped of its former fragrance. She no longer invited anyone in. The first few weeks, neighbors had stopped by with kind words and careful glances, offering advice about watering and soil. But she had grown tired of their sympathy, tired of their gentle suggestions that sounded too much like pity. Now she preferred to sit alone, listening to the wind pass through the hollow stalks of her failed blooms. That afternoon, a soft sound broke her thoughts, the rhythmic scrape of a hoe against the earth. Across the narrow lane, Ben was working in his garden again. His patch had transformed over the months into something alive and humming with quiet music. Sunflowers towered like golden sentinels, their faces turned faithfully toward the weak autumn sun. Clusters of thyme, rosemary, and sage bordered the beds, their scents rising in warm, resinous clouds whenever the wind stirred them. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, and a pair of white butterflies flitted over the marigolds, bright as drops of sunlight. Anya stood watching for a long time before she crossed the lane. Her boots left faint impressions in the damp earth. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of bees. Ben looked up and smiled, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet understanding. "Thank you," he said. "It took time." She crouched by the fence and ran her fingers through the dark soil near his garden bed. It was rich and crumbly, warm even in the cool air. "It's soft," she murmured. "Like cake," Ben chuckled. "That's what compost does. It feeds the earth. Every bit of life that dies returns something for the next one to grow." Anya looked down at her own hands, the dirt darkening her fingertips. "I thought